Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality and clinical practice. I'm your host, Doc Bach, and I'm here with my co-host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and y'all, we have had a lively discussion on YouTube with our Schizoid series. I know that we've received a lot of questions about today's topic, and I am thrilled to be able to talk about it. In today's episode, our resident research ninja, Doc Fish, is going to help us unpack the differences between autism and schizoid personality. And we're also going to answer some listener viewer questions about these diagnoses. Today, we'll also get into a really thought-provoking question that we received about schizoid fantasies. So let's keep this lively discussion going as we dive in. Doc Fish, you have spent a lot of time researching schizoid and autism and came across some really interesting and disheartening things. So I want to hear more about this research that you found.
Sure. So firstly, our terminology of what schizoid is versus what autism is, it's just horrible. Specifically for this episode, I want to set the frame by saying there's a lot of limitations to this research, like a lot of limitations. The terminology in the research, like across different researchers, across different disciplines, and even across history is absolutely terrible. Like the worst I've seen thus far, honestly.
My goodness. Okay, this doesn't surprise me because historically we have been so bad about naming things as shrinks, like so bad. Like we historically call things the same name that are different things. And I just think back to all the different DSM diagnoses that we've already done this. And I'm going to guess that we're calling schizoids autistic, among other things.
You got it. It's really frustrating. So we're trying to compare and contrast schizoid personality disorder and autism spectrum disorder today. So we do have to look at both constructs' terminology.
Yeah.
So first, researchers looking at schizoid and autism are comparing samples, including like the DSM-influenced schizoid personality disorder. Fine, good, okay. But they also include other labels and criteria of like schizotypy as a trait, schizotypal personality disorder, and schizophrenia. So like, for example, one study sample of schizoid included individuals across the schizotypal spectrum. So we're not like actually looking at pure schizoid, but a range of schizoid-like symptoms.
Right. Yeah, this is not helpful. Like we can't just lump it all together when we're comparing and contrasting diagnoses because schizoid does exist at different severity levels. And then when we compare it to autism, also happening at different severity levels, like we need to know which end of the continuum we're working with. Like for schizoid, is it mild? Is it personality disordered? Has it disintegrated into schizophrenia? That's important to know.
Absolutely. So that's like one flaw and limitation. Another is the operational definition of autism spectrum disorder. So obviously this is influenced by historical changes, right? So early research often compares schizoid and Asperger's disorder, separating it from autism. Then there's different levels of functioning in autism. Since, well, now it's like a spectrum disorder. So some articles use samples of like high functioning autism, but then like where's the cutoff? It's unclear. That's a research limitation as well.
Right. So our classification system has evolved over time, but it still has flaws. And we're not quite sure what is being studied in this research that you found because our definition and severity cutoffs have changed over the decades.
Exactly. So that in particular makes it difficult to generalize the findings. Okay, so here is another extra confusing part. Schizoid phenomena was historically, and sometimes still is, intertwined with the terms autistic thinking and autistic fantasy.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I'm thinking we need to define these terms too, right? So, all right, let's go to the APA Dictionary. APA Dictionary of Psychology defines autistic thinking as an outdated term for egocentric thought processes, such as fantasizing and daydreaming that have little or no relation to reality.
So autistic thinking focuses on self-absorption into the thoughts, but not to the point that someone is disconnected from reality.
Exactly. Yep. So then the definition goes on to say that the term is highly inaccurate and misleading regarding the thinking styles of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. So it's called autistic, but it's not autistic as we know by today's terms.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Okay. So then they define autistic fantasy as, quote, a defense mechanism in which a person deals with emotional conflict and stressors by indulging in excessive daydreaming as a substitute for active problem solving.
Which is essentially what we mean when we describe the schizoid's tendency to defend themselves by withdrawing into fantasy, right?
Exactly. And then we have the dictionary definition of autism to consider too.
Of course. Yep. Let's bring that in here. So when looking at autism, it comes from the Greek root auto, meaning self. And then the Greek suffix ism means a state of being. So basically being within oneself, which sounds a bit schizoidy, right?
It totally does. Oh my goodness. And I do want to throw in one more term because it has to do with schizoid and object relations, which we talked about last episode. So a psychoanalyst named Thomas Ogden coined the term autistic contiguous position.
Ooh.
Basically, what that is saying is like there's a spectrum of moving away or towards an object, depending on how comforting or dangerous the object is.
Okay. So if it's not a safe relationship, then move away and inside the self.
Right. And then this can become pathological later if it turns into like a rigid and flexible defense.
Of course. Yeah. This is really interesting because this is describing the schizoid, like not the neurodevelopmental disorder of autism, like really not at all. So the schizoid fears being overwhelmed by or consumed by others, so they retreat into the mind, going deeper and deeper into themselves. And then that rigidity is what leads to a personality disorder, and specifically here, schizoid or schizoid personality disorder.
Exactly. So the literature on the connections, the overlaps, and the differences of schizoid personality disorder and autism spectrum disorder is like ridiculously hindered by terminology and definitions. The two are very intertwined, and that's why we're trying to tackle it today.
Yep. So with all this, it sounds like research is quite muddy. And what we talk about here is in desperate need of more research.
Exactly. So autism could be on the line of schizoid, but research doesn't really support it, but it's still a possibility. But like McWilliams doesn't rule it out, but Milan kind of infers that it is. And the DSM says no, but other researchers say yes. And it's just a mess.
Lovely. So why don't we start unpacking this mess a little bit, starting with the overlap. Okay, so I think some of these similarities go without saying, so we won't camp here long, but the observable things are the social component or lack thereof with both autism and schizoid.
Sure. Okay. So briefly, several overlapping criteria include like solitary activity, apparent lack of empathy, emotional detachment, increased sensitivity, unusual styles of communication, and being cognitively rigid.
So we see the outside observable stuff, like maybe chilliness or social awkwardness, or even like lack of social reciprocity or like volleying a conversation back and forth. Also solitary play or activities, being asocial or sometimes not responding to social cues. And even fixed interests could be interpreted either as skis or as autism.
Now, there's been a little research about early communication problems. So Wolf, 1998, investigated schizoid and autism dynamics in apparent schizoid children. I think this is fascinating. So they had 3 schizoid boys and 3 schizoid girls, and they were electively mute in contrast to language delays.
Okay, this is another piece. Yes. So is the person nonverbal because of developmental delays, Or is this selective mutism, where a person doesn't talk in certain settings due to extreme anxiety? It's similar observable behavior, but very different root causes.
And for the schizoid child, I do wonder if it's extreme anxiety and or maybe just, a choice to not spend the social energy talking to people who don't get them.
This is where it gets tricky when we start making diagnoses without a thorough look at someone's history and their behavior across contexts. So for both autism and schizoid, we can't just look at the social stuff or the observable stuff. Like, we have to know where the behavior is coming from in order to make the diagnosis. And that takes time and often involves information from caregivers and spouses and other people in their circles, etc.
Yeah, we need to take the time to look inside and see what's actually going on.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's take a peek at genetics to see how these conditions develop. See if this can help us out at all. Okay, research has connected schizoid personality with schizophrenia. The schizoid is still in reality, versus schizophrenia is the decompensated schizoid or schizotypal personality that is out of touch with reality.
Yes. So it is common in the literature to refer to the continuum of like schizoid to schizotypal to schizophrenia. Schizoid's in reality. Schizotypal is like towing the line of reality. And then schizophrenia is kind of falling out of reality into psychosis.
Indeed. Yeah. So we know that schizophrenia has a strong genetic loading. Like, research tells us that the risk of schizophrenia increases 8 to 11-fold if a first-degree relative had it.
That is substantial. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So Wolf basically kind of asked the same question regarding genetic lines in like skis and autism. So in the DSM, it notes that genetically, schizotypal personality disorder occurs more in first-degree relatives of schizophrenia, and then schizoid personality disorder, quote, may have increased prevalence in the relatives of individuals with schizophrenia or schizotypal personality disorder.
This is really interesting. So there is the clear genetic connection among the three skis or skits conditions.
However, in regard to the heritability of autism, the DSM estimates have ranged from 37% to higher than 90%. Based on twin concordance rates. And a more recent 5-country cohort estimated heritability at like 80%.
So this is significant heritability for autism. So the autism and skis development seem to have different genetic loadings. Like, they're not overlapping here. It doesn't appear to be the same gene line.
Right. Each has that substantial genetic loading in their own lane, but those lanes don't necessarily cross.
So with autism, research tells us that we have comorbidity with other neurodiagnoses or developmental diagnoses, things like ADHD, Tourette's, learning and intellectual disabilities, movement disorders, eating disorders like ARFID, sleep issues, and even epilepsy. So these often are occurring in the same person, and they give us clues that these are foundational issues, right? Like neuro issues, telling us that there may be something in the hardwiring or the genes that is contributing to this autism development.
Right. Some studies have even found that autism correlates in families with a specific gene mutation.
Yep. So again, we have the schizoid related genetics, and then we have the autism related genetics. They don't appear to overlap, yet the external observable characteristics overlap and even look the same. So, help.
Right. Oh my goodness. We're trying to compare two presentations where we have difficulty seeing what's going on inside. So there's an overlap of those observable characteristics, but not necessarily the individual's internal experiences.
Always. What is under that observable behavior that we're seeing? Yeah. Okay. So there's separate conditions that look similar externally. Per the DSM, you can't have both autism spectrum disorder and schizoid personality disorder. Like they're not comorbid. In fact, they can't be.
Yes. So criterion B of schizoid personality disorder specifically says that it, quote, does not occur exclusively during the course of autism spectrum disorder. Then in the differential diagnosis section of schizoid personality disorder in regard to autism spectrum disorder, it highlights that there can be great difficulty differentiating those from schizoid from those with autism, especially if their symptoms are more mild, because both disorders include a, quote, seeming indifference to companionship with others.
So we're comparing apples to oranges here. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition. Schizoid is a personality style or disorder, as in the DSM. So I like to think of it like this. The personality is like the walls of a house that encapsulate all our psych stuff. So things like disorders, thoughts and fantasies, etc. So the personality walls can be made from all kinds of materials and defenses and serve to either keep people in or keep people out.
Okay, that makes sense.
But with autism, it's neurodevelopmentally based, which is like the foundation of the house. So everything in the house relies on that stable foundation, like our ability to meet developmental milestones, to learn, to walk, to talk, to sit up, to imagine and play with other children, and to have healthy social interactions.
Okay, so autism is a social hardwiring issue. So something in the foundational DNA is like incomplete. Then for schizoid personality disorder, the social hardwiring is intact. However, it might fry easily or shut down or...
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yep. Yeah. So said a different way, autism is deficit-based versus schizoid personality disorder is defense mechanism-based, as with all personality disorders.
I like that. Yeah.
So I will also say that while we generally have a negative opinion of how the DSM describes schizoid, the DSM does seem to get the categories correct. So there's a reason that autism spectrum disorder is in the neurodevelopmental disorder section of the DSM, while schizoid personality disorder is in the personality disorder section. Like two different things, which is also what research tells us. So I do think that the DSM is getting this part right.
Right. And I can see how they can look very similar on the outside, but come from very different places. So the origin is the key.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Okay, so then that takes me to like the development of autism. So as we stated previously, you often see these foundational issues really early on, like with the development of motor skills and speech, reciprocal social imitation, or imaginative play with other children.
Okay, exactly. Autism is seen in the developmental milestones anywhere from infancy to age 2, 3, and it includes a lack of imaginative play. Then schizoid infants, they can be difficult to soothe, highly sensitive, but we really don't see the pathological traits emerge until about middle childhood when they're facing more social developmental milestones. And then also super important, schizoid children don't lack imagination. The opposite, really. Like they can actually have trouble figuring out make-believe from reality.
Yes, this is key. So lack of imagination in autism versus too much of it as in schizoid personality disorder. Yeah. Okay. I will say too that though there can be a later diagnosis of autism, it's pretty rare. Like it's the exception and not the rule for it to be diagnosed much later, like teens into adulthood, but it can happen. But the important piece here is there is a developmental component to autism. It's not a social diagnosis, and it's not just measuring social awkwardness.
Yeah. culturally, I think we're seeing a shift towards people seeking autism diagnoses without concrete symptoms other than, feeling different, being socially awkward, engaging in self-soothing behavior for anxiety. That social hardwiring is actually still intact.
Exactly. It sure is. Yeah. It's a concerning trend that seems in large part fueled by social media and a need to fit in with peers, but it is not autism, which then it makes me wonder if we have like other personality styles that are seeking an autism diagnosis for some type of gain, whatever the reason is, social or otherwise. But I will say it is a concerning trend that many of us professionals are noticing.
That's very, very true. But also, Talkbach, let's get back on track with the development and the schizoid child's imagination.
Yes, you better stop me now so I don't go down that rabbit hole. But that is something that we've talked about in previous episodes on like what's trending and what's happening. So we'll shelf that, bring it back down for another day. But yes, as you said, Dogfish, those with autism don't have much ability for fantasy or imagination.
Yes. So those with autism are often very rigid and concrete versus a schizoid who has a rich and vibrant fantasy world filled with imaginations, but they might not tell you about it, obviously.
Yes, because that's their gold stash. Like they're not going to give you the map to their treasure. Are you kidding?
Oh my gosh, exactly. They have to protect their fantasy.
Yes. And this here is a great place to answer the thought-provoking question that we received from a viewer about fantasy in the schizoid. So essentially, this person's hypothesis was that for the schizoid, an attachment figure is replaced by fantasy. Interaction with the real world means letting go of fantasy to interact socially. So then, in their words, reality becomes like a controlling lever, keeping you from everything that makes you feel a sense of self because it's all buried within. Whew, it's real deep. What are your thoughts, Dogfish?
Yes, I love the depth of this hypothesis. So whether it's correct or incorrect doesn't really matter here, but it made me think about the antisocial or psychopathic individuals' object relations where they don't have an internal attachment object. Instead, they attach to or align with a stranger object or like an archetypal object from society. But oppositely, I think it's totally possible that a schizoid could replace human attachment with their own internal fantasy that serves to house the development of one sense of self. But then to interact with others, they're going to inherently represent reality since they're not part of the fantasy.
Yeah.
And that would be really intrusive. It would have to involve at least some level of disconnection from fantasy and thus disconnection from the sense of self. So maybe at more mild levels, this dynamic could just be exhausting maybe or annoying. But at more severe levels, I imagine it could be like seriously distressing, like making me think of a turtle running around without its shell.
Oh no. Yeah. Gosh, I have my own hypothesis about this. So most schizoids that I know prefer their own company to the company of others. So I would imagine that there's something alluring about that fantasy world because it's serving a purpose and possibly as an attachment substitute. And it actually reminds me of a conversation that we had last episode about schizoids intensely pursuing a passion or a job like Sherlock Holmes or composers, almost like it's a substitute for a lover. Yeah, so their fantasies provide stimulation, companionship, intrigue, safety, and a way to get out any socially inappropriate frustrations, like in their mind where it's safe. In their minds, they can tell that person off in their head or flip them the bird. And it makes me want to ask our skis listeners and viewers, do you think there's a reparenting that's happening through fantasy? And if so, what makes you think that? Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, it makes me think of the fantasies that they might have of world domination, but they're not going to be the person that goes for that. Right. So it houses that unconscious sexual and aggressive drives that we detach from as a schizoid personality.
Right. And they're not going to show you the treasure map either of like, here's all my fantasies.
Exactly. Super deep stuff. I also do have a random, but it's actually relevant question for the schizoids. How do you feel about reasons? Like genuinely, like please let me know how you feel about reasons.
Yeah, there's a method to the madness here. Yeah, we have some interesting things that we're looking into. So curious about that. Let us know in the comments. But bringing this back around, I do think there's another piece of research that's worth noting here. Doc Fish, do you want to tell us a little bit more about mirror neurons?
Yes, I love this. Okay, findings on mirror neurons and facial expressions. I find this super duper fascinating, and I think it's extremely important to know at least two specific studies. Kring and Moran, 2008, found that those with schizophrenia were found to have deficits in observable facial expressions, but not micro expressions, which others didn't pick up on.
Ooh, okay. So schizophrenic participants had micro expressions that other people couldn't detect, but a computer could. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So the emotional physio stuff under the surface was normal in comparison to the control sample. In other words, schizophrenics experience emotions normally. They just don't express it.
And because they don't express it, people interacting with the schizophrenic patients decreased their own expressiveness and reported they felt more negative experiences, which is perhaps why we may overpathologize them.
Think you're onto something there. Yeah. So under the surface, schizophrenics are having the exact same emotional experiences as you and I now. They're just not telling you about it. And then we as a society feel a way about their lack of expression and then project our own negative feelings and things onto them.
Exactly. Yes. I have more though. Okay. McCormick et al. 2012 described that actively psychotic individuals had increased mirror neuron activity. Schizophrenic individuals had average mirror neuron activity, and then individuals on the autism spectrum were found to have little to no mirror neuron activity when observing others.
Okay, hold up. So with active psychosis, where the individual is responding to their own internal stimuli plus the external stimuli, so their system is basically overactivated, right? So then in schizophrenia, it was normal, not overactivated, normal. And not underactivated either. But even still, we aren't privy to their emotions or their responses. In contrast, with autism, the social hardwiring is not intact. The mirror neurons don't even fire because they can't detect those social cues. Science. Yes.
It's so fascinating.
This is so interesting. Wow.
Okay, so Doc Bach, we should actually talk about our thoughts.
Yeah.
Because really, we want to kind of explore the question of, can autism spectrum disorder and schizoid personality disorder occur in the same person?
Yes. Yep. We need to get into that. Okay. So I'll go first. So per the DSM, which is disorder based, the answer is no. You can't have both disorders at the same time. If you do have both, one is probably a misdiagnosis. That's my opinion. Okay, so then if there's evidence of developmental stuff, fixed interest and social deficits, autism is likely. If it's just the social oddities or withdrawal, you're probably looking at schizoid personality disorder. And of course, this is a gross oversimplification, of course, but teasing these out takes lots and lots of time. Consultation with other professionals too, of course, an extensive social history of the individual. Like, you need to look at all of that. Yeah.
Yes. But that's what the DSM says. Autism spectrum disorder and schizoid personality disorder cannot be diagnosed at the same time.
Mm-mm.
And you're right. In cases we've seen that could go either way, we've really had to look close at history and, if possible, even hear from other people in the individual's life.
Yeah, it confuses even us, and we study this stuff. Like, my goodness. All right. So if the person truly has autism spectrum disorder, schizoid personality disorder is moot, because if the social hardwiring is not intact, it can't be a personality disorder. So with autism, the foundational social circuit is missing pieces, versus in schizoid personality disorder, they're using defenses to keep the social circuit from frying. Right? So personality disorders can't be diagnosed if the reason for social pathology is based on a developmental deficit. Like, that just doesn't even make sense.
Okay, I see what you're saying here. So if you have a diagnosis of schizoid personality disorder, you're not going to automatically be on the autism spectrum.
Yep.
But if you are on the autism spectrum, you still have a personality, which may be schizoid.
I actually have a hypothesis that autism spectrum disorder can come in all packages of personality, but it's not going to be at disorder level because it can't be. Like, you could possibly have a schiz-oriented temperament and someone who's autistic, but that schiz would not be at disorder level.
Okay, I really like that hypothesis that autism can come in all packages of personality because they have personalities.
Yeah.
Okay, so then in my opinion as well, someone with autism should not be diagnosed with disorder level personality. I think that's simply not fair, and it's redundant because the difficulties stem from neurodevelopmental stuff.
Yeah. So I think of it like this. Individuals with autism don't come with a full social toolbox. Their tools are missing. Individuals with personality disorders have the social tools in the toolbox, but they either misuse them or don't use them at all. So it's unfair and just not correct to call someone with autism who doesn't have the tools personality disordered.
I can totally agree with that. That does make sense. Now, for funsies, another study with another perspective.
Ooh, okay.
Nerdy stuff. So if we ignore that autism and schizoid personality disorder cannot be diagnosed in the same person according to the DSM, one study took a group of people diagnosed with Asperger's disorder, because it was 2012, and they investigated which personality disorders overlapped. So from greatest to least, Asperger's overlapped with schizoid, 26%, obsessive compulsive at 19%, avoidant at 13%, and schizotypal at 2%. But my favorite point in this particular study is that there's no overlap with any cluster B personality disorders. Like zero, not a zip.
Oh boy. Okay. This is actually really interesting. So I would imagine that cluster B leaning types are the least likely to overlap with autism, but sometimes they seem to be seeking out the diagnosis. I didn't say that. You didn't hear that. Okay. But because cluster Bs are dramatic and socially engaged and elicit reactions from others, versus with clusters A and C, like they could go either way socially.
Right. Dramatic and erratic is kind of opposite of the skis dynamics. So one viewer even stated that schizoids are the opposite of cluster Bs.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I totally agree. Yep.
Now, regarding the cluster C overlap, I think it's interesting that psychodynamic perspectives often include avoidant personality disorder into like schizoid conceptualization, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it's one perspective. Yeah. And then obsessive compulsive personality disorder is the only differential diagnosis for schizoid listed in McWilliams' book, which makes me think maybe there's like an overlap with a hard outside shell and compulsive like behaviors to protect it.
Ooh, yes. Yeah, that compulsive shell comes up in a lot of different personality styles and even personality disorders, which is where it gets tricky because you have to look at what's beyond that shell and what's really at the core. But unfortunately, we don't have time to get into all of that today. I wish we did, but there's so many different flavors of personality and possibilities that can pop up. And that's even true with schizoid. It can come in different shades and hues, which is really interesting. Yeah. And I will say too, we have had a lot of viewer and listener questions on schizoid versus avoidant personality disorder, which is also kind of hotly debated in our field as well. But we will have to get to that in a separate episode because there's a lot to unpack with that too, of course.
My last thoughts on this though, is that we are mere humans. We're imperfect and complex.
Yeah.
Even though autism and schizoid genetic lines are separate, according to imperfect human researchers, there's nothing saying that it can't intersect in a family or an individual at some point. I don't think there's any use making concrete facts about these questions because we're simply too vast and complex to be put in like a box or a label or a category. Individually, like we're all unique as it should be.
Yeah, I love that perspective, Doc Fish. Yeah. And I think it's important to note that as science advances, like our understanding of humans deepens and then research gets updated and then our opinions change. And they could change here too, based on new information and new research that we have. So boxes and categories aside, like we are all human at the end of the day.
Fortunately or unfortunately, yes.
Maybe some of us are wishing we were computers. I don't know. Maybe not.
Maybe.
Anyway, so in sum, we hope that you've learned something about the differences between schizoid personality disorder and autism spectrum disorder. They're two different diagnoses measuring two very different parts of the psyche, the foundational neurodevelopmental stuff and the protective walls of the personality. And this is also supported by genetic studies looking at heritability that found autism and skis to be two separate tracks. It's complicated. We know that. And our research about this is grossly incomplete and confusing. And we could use more help understanding if there is overlap beyond this social awkwardness that we see in both. And on that note, that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of The Personality Couch. Make sure to check out our blogs that coincide with these episodes at www.personalitycouch.com. And as always, don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe, or rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. And on YouTube, hit that bell so you don't miss a single episode of our Schizoid personality series. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on The Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.